The woods were not always this quiet. Once, children played on its edges, laughter mixing with birdsong as villagers walked its paths to collect firewood or hunt. But something changed years ago. The stories started as whispers, a hunter who never returned, a woman who claimed to hear her name called in the dead of night, though no one was there. Soon, the whispers grew into warnings. Don't go into the woods after dark. By the time Sarah moved into the old, creaky house at the edge of town, the woods were an unspoken taboo. She liked that about them. Sarah had a knack for ignoring rules, especially the superstitious kind. She was an urbanite, newly divorced, and desperate for quiet. The isolation appealed to her, a chance to reset. The locals, though kind, were evasive whenever she mentioned the woods. The old woman at the market even grasped Sarah's wrist one day and hissed, "Don't let it call you." She dismissed it all as nonsense. One evening, Sarah stood on her porch, wine glass in hand, staring into the forest's edge. The moon hung low, casting long shadows that shifted unnaturally with the breeze. She felt the faintest tug in her chest, like a thread being gently pulled. For a moment, it seemed the shadows moved not with the wind, but against it. A voice, soft as silk, whispered her name. Sarah froze, the glass slipping from her hand and shattering on the wooden floor. "Must be the wine," she muttered, retreating inside and locking the door. But the whispers didn't stop. The next night, they began again. She lay in bed, listening to the faint call. Sarah. It wasn't just her name. It was the way it was said, familiar, tender, yet filled with something darker. She buried her head under the pillow, trying to drown it out, but it lingered, clawing at her thoughts. By the third night, Sarah was unraveling. She tried blasting music, drinking until her vision blurred, even sleeping with every light on. Nothing worked. The woods weren't just outside. They had crept into her mind, rooting themselves in every shadowed corner. Finally, she decided to confront her fears. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of defiance, she ventured into the woods at dusk. The villagers watched from their windows, their faces pale and drawn, but no one tried to stop her. The forest was alive. Not in the way a forest should be, with rustling leaves and distant animal calls. It breathed, sighed, and groaned like a living, ancient thing. The trees twisted unnaturally, their gnarled branches reaching for her like skeletal hands. The whispers grew louder as she walked, morphing into voices she recognized. Her mother, long dead, called to her from the shadows. Then her ex-husband, his voice dripping with mockery. "You've always been so stubborn, Sarah." The flashlight flickered, then died. Darkness swallowed her whole. Panic surged, and she stumbled, her breaths ragged and shallow. The ground beneath her feet shifted, the earth soft and wet, as though the forest were trying to pull her under. And then she saw it. A figure loomed ahead, taller than any tree, its form draped in writhing shadows. It had no face, only a void where one should be. But she knew it was looking at her. It stretched a hand forward, impossibly long fingers curling in invitation. "You came," it said, though its mouth never moved. Its voice was a symphony of all the whispers that had haunted her, blending into a single hypnotic melody. She wanted to run, but her body refused. Her legs rooted to the spot as though the earth had claimed her. The creature stepped closer, its presence suffocating. "Stay," it said, its voice like a lover's plea. Sarah opened her mouth to scream, but the sound never came. Darkness poured into her, filling her lungs, her veins, her mind. The last thing she saw before the void consumed her was the creature's hand, now inches from her face, its touch as cold as death. When the villagers found her house the next morning, it was empty. The door hung open, the wine glass still shattered on the porch. Only the forest seemed unchanged, quiet, watchful, as if waiting for its next visitor. And if you stood at the edge, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, you might hear it. A faint whisper, carried on the wind.
Story number 2.
It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. 4 friends, Lena, Marcus, Jared, and Claire, decided to escape the monotony of city life and spend a weekend in the remote Black Hollow woods. The place had a reputation, of course. Locals called it cursed, said no one who wandered too far ever came back. But that only made it more thrilling for them. Young, fearless, and hungry for adventure, they shrugged off the warnings like a ghost story told to scare children. The first night was perfect. They laughed around a crackling fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. Jared, the skeptic, mocked the legends. "It's just trees," he said, gesturing toward the dark expanse beyond the firelight. "What's so scary about trees?" But as the night wore on, the forest seemed to close in. The firelight didn't stretch as far as it should, and the woods grew oppressively silent. No rustling leaves, no nocturnal animals, just stillness. Claire noticed it first. She was sitting closest to the woods when she froze mid-laugh. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Marcus asked, tossing another log into the fire. "That clicking sound." The others went quiet, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing. Then it came, a faint, rhythmic clicking, like bones tapping together. "Probably just a deer or something," Jared said, though his voice wavered. They tried to laugh it off, but the sound persisted, growing louder, closer. It seemed to circle them, moving just beyond the firelight. Lena grabbed a flashlight and pointed it toward the woods. The beam cut through the darkness, but it revealed nothing except twisted trees and gnarled roots. "See?" "Nothing there," she said, though her hands trembled. They decided to call it a night, retreating to the safety of their tents. But sleep didn't come easily. The clicking sound followed them, faint but unrelenting. Hours passed before Marcus finally unzipped his tent. "I can't take this anymore. I'm going to check it out." "Don't be stupid," Claire hissed. "Stay in the tent." But Marcus was already stepping into the night. The others listened as his footsteps crunched through the underbrush, then faded. Silence returned. Then came the scream. It was raw, inhuman, a sound that tore through the night like a razor. The others bolted out of their tents, calling Marcus's name. The fire had gone out, leaving them in near-total darkness. Claire turned on her flashlight, the beam shaking wildly as she searched. Marcus! The light caught movement ahead. Something stood just beyond the trees. At first, they thought it was Marcus, but as the figure stepped closer, they saw it wasn't human. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched taut over a skeletal frame. Its face, or what should have been a face, was featureless, save for a wide, jagged mouth that split open, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. The clicking sound was coming from its hands, long fingers tapping together in a grotesque rhythm. They ran. Branches tore at their clothes and skin as they stumbled blindly through the woods. The creature's clicking followed, relentless and steady, no matter how fast they moved. Jared tripped, screaming for help as the others kept running. His cries were cut short, replaced by a wet, tearing sound that made Claire gag. "Don't stop," Lena yelled, dragging Claire forward. They burst into a clearing, panting and disoriented. But the clicking was gone. The silence was worse. We have to find the road," Claire stammered. Lena nodded, pulling out her phone to check the GPS, but the screen flickered and died. They were completely cut off. As they turned to leave the clearing, the clicking returned, louder than ever. It came from all directions now, surrounding them. One by one, pale figures emerged from the trees. There were dozens of them, all identical, their mouths splitting open in unison to release an ear-piercing shriek. The last thing Lena and Claire saw was a wall of pale limbs reaching for them, the creatures dragging them into the darkness. By sunrise, the campsite was empty. Locals found the remains a week later, shredded tents, claw marks gouged into trees, and a single blood-stained flashlight. No one dared venture into Black Hollow Woods again. But on certain nights, if you're foolish enough to stand at its edge, you might hear it, the faint clicking of bones tapping together, waiting for the next visitors to wander too far.
Story number 3.
The storm hit just as Sam and his younger brother, Danny, reached the old Pine Brook Trail. They hadn't planned on being out so late, but a wrong turn and a dying phone battery left them scrambling to find their way back to the car. The woods, once serene and bathed in autumn sunlight, were now cloaked in a suffocating darkness. Sam kept his flashlight trained on the trail, but the rain came down in sheets, distorting everything. "Stay close to me," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. Danny didn't respond. Sam glanced back and saw his brother clutching his backpack, his eyes wide with fear. "We'll be fine," Sam lied. "We just need to follow the path." But the path was disappearing. The rain turned the dirt into mud, erasing the faint markers they had been following. Trees loomed like silent sentinels, their bare branches clawing at the sky. Then they saw it. At first, Sam thought it was a trick of the light, a figure standing just off the trail. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with arms too long for its body, its head tilted slightly as if observing them. "Do you see that?" Danny whispered, gripping Sam's jacket. Sam nodded, his throat dry. "Just keep walking." They moved faster, but the figure didn't fade into the distance as they hoped. It moved with them, its long limbs barely making a sound despite the wet ground. "It's following us," Danny whimpered. "Don't look at it," Sam ordered. "Just keep your eyes forward." But curiosity got the better of Danny. He glanced back and let out a strangled cry. "It's closer!" Sam turned, his flashlight trembling as he aimed it at the figure. For a moment, he wished he hadn't. Its face, or what passed for one, was smooth and featureless, save for deep, hollow indentations where eyes should have been. Its mouth was a jagged gash that stretched too wide, revealing rows of teeth that seemed to shimmer in the light. Sam grabbed Danny's arm and ran. The path twisted and turned, but they didn't dare stop. The sound of snapping branches and squelching mud followed them, growing louder with each step. The trail opened into a small clearing, and for a brief moment, Sam thought they had lost it. But then the air grew heavy, like the world itself was holding its breath. Danny screamed. Sam spun around and saw the figure standing directly behind them, its mouth gaping open. From that void came a low, guttural noise, a sound that seemed to vibrate through their bones. "Run!" Sam yelled, shoving Danny forward. They bolted into the trees, abandoning the trail entirely. The woods became a labyrinth of shadows and tangled roots. Sam's flashlight flickered, its beam barely cutting through the darkness. Then Danny tripped. Sam skidded to a halt, turning back to help his brother. But before he could reach him, the creature emerged from the shadows. Its arms extended, fingers impossibly long and sharp, curling around Danny like a spider wrapping its prey. "No!" Sam screamed, lunging forward. But the creature moved within human speed, dragging Danny into the darkness. Danny's screams echoed once, then abruptly stopped. Sam stumbled through the woods, desperate and disoriented. His flashlight died, plunging him into complete darkness. He ran blindly, branches tearing at his face and clothes. Finally, he broke through the trees and onto the road. His car was just ahead, its headlights barely visible through the rain. He collapsed into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut and locking it. His hands shook as he fumbled for the keys, and when the engine roared to life, relief washed over him. But as he looked in the rearview mirror, his blood turned to ice. In the back seat, hollow eyes stared back at him. The last thing Sam heard was the low, guttural noise that filled the car, drowning out his screams. By morning, the car was found abandoned on the side of the road, its doors wide open. There was no sign of Sam or Danny, only deep claw marks gouged into the hood and a single word scratched into the windshield. Hungry.
Story number 4.
The sign at the edge of Elderwood Forest read, "Do not enter after dusk." For most people, the warning was enough. The stories about the forest were chilling, hunters disappearing without a trace, strange lights flickering between the trees, and voices that mimicked loved ones. But for Ethan, it was nothing more than folklore. He'd grown up hearing those tales and never believed a word of them. That evening, when his friends dared him to spend the night in the woods, he didn't hesitate. Armed with only a flashlight, a sleeping bag, and his bravado, Ethan entered Elderwood just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The forest was quiet at first, unnervingly so. No birds, no insects, just the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. Ethan laughed to himself, shaking his head at the absurdity of it all. "Scary stories for kids," he muttered, setting up camp in a small clearing. By the time he got his sleeping bag laid out, the woods had changed. The air felt heavier, the shadows darker. The trees seemed to lean closer, their twisted branches framing the sky like skeletal fingers. And then came the whisper. At first, it was faint, barely audible. A soft, breathy voice that seemed to drift on the wind. "Ethan!" He froze, his heart hammering in his chest. "Who's there?" he called, spinning in a circle with his flashlight. The beam revealed nothing but trees and darkness. "Ethan." The voice came again, louder this time. It wasn't just a random sound, it knew his name. He tried to laugh it off. "Nice try, guys," he shouted. "I know you're out there." But no one responded. Then he heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, and impossibly close. The beam of his flashlight danced across the clearing, but there was nothing there. The footsteps continued, circling him, though the ground around him remained undisturbed. A branch snapped behind him. Ethan whirled around, his breath catching. A figure stood just beyond the edge of the clearing. It was human-shaped, but wrong in every way. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. The flashlight barely seemed to touch it, as if the darkness clung to its form. Who are you?" Ethan stammered, stepping back. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it moved closer, its movements jerky like a marionette on tangled strings. "Stay back!" Ethan yelled, his voice cracking. The figure stopped just short of the flashlight's edge. Its face, or what passed for a face, was a swirling void, shifting and flickering like smoke caught in a bottle. Then it spoke, and the sound made Ethan's stomach churn. It was his own voice. "Why did you come here?" it said, perfectly mimicking him. Ethan's legs buckled, and he fell backward. The creature loomed over him, its void-like face splitting open into a jagged grin. Suddenly, the whispering returned, louder, overlapping voices swirling around him. They weren't just random words, they were familiar. His mother's voice, scolding him, his childhood friend, laughing. A teacher, calling his name in class. They blended into an overwhelming cacophony that filled his head, drowning out his thoughts. He scrambled to his feet and ran. The flashlight bounced wildly in his hand, the beam flickering as though the batteries were dying. The whispers followed him, growing louder, more desperate. The forest twisted around him, the path disappearing. No matter which way he turned, the trees seemed to block his escape, their branches clawing at his clothes and skin. Then he saw the lights. They floated in the distance, small and flickering, like lanterns swaying in the wind. Desperate, Ethan chased them, hoping they would lead him to safety. But as he got closer, he realized they weren't lanterns at all. They were eyes, hundreds of them, glowing and unblinking, embedded in the trees. The whispers turned into screams. Ethan dropped the flashlight and clutched his head, trying to block out the noise. But it wasn't just in his ears. It was inside him, digging into his thoughts, his memories. When he finally opened his eyes, the forest was silent again. The trees stood still, the air calm. But Ethan was no longer in the clearing, no longer near the path. He stood in a dense, dark part of the forest where the ground seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. The figure was there, along with others like it. Dozens of shadowy forms, their void faces grinning, their eyes glowing faintly. They surrounded him, their movements slow and deliberate. Ethan tried to scream, but no sound came out. By the time the search party found his campsite the next morning, all they discovered was his flashlight lying in the mud, its beam still faintly flickering. Of Ethan, there was no trace. But sometimes, when the wind blew just right, the villagers claimed they could hear him, a whisper in the woods. "Help me."
Story number 5.
It started with a dare. Amber, Kyle, and Jenna had heard the rumors about Ashwick Asylum, the decaying psychiatric hospital that sat on the edge of town like a festering wound. Abandoned for decades, it was said to be haunted by the patients who died there, their spirits restless and angry. Locals spoke of lights flickering in the broken windows at night and strange screams echoing from its depths. Kyle, the fearless one, scoffed at the idea. "It's just an old building," he said, grinning. "Let's prove it's all fake." Amber hesitated, but she didn't want to seem like a coward. Jenna, ever the skeptic, rolled her eyes but agreed. Armed with flashlights, their phones, and a single crowbar to pry open the chained front doors, they ventured into the asylum just after midnight. The moment they stepped inside, the air changed. It was colder than it should have been, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. The stench of mildew and rot was overpowering, and every step echoed unnaturally, as though the building itself was listening. Their flashlights illuminated peeling wallpaper, rusted gurneys, and graffiti scrawled by previous trespassers. "Help me," one wall read in jagged letters. Another had a crude drawing of a face, its hollow eyes staring back at them. "This isn't so bad," Kyle said, his voice too loud in the oppressive silence. "Just creepy old junk." But then Amber noticed something strange. The graffiti on the walls didn't look faded. The paint was fresh, almost wet. She touched the word "leave" written near the stairwell and pulled her hand back, her fingertips smeared with red. "That's not paint," she whispered, her stomach turning. Kyle laughed nervously. "Don't be dramatic." They pushed deeper into the asylum, their footsteps crunching over shattered glass and debris. The hallways seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and branching in ways that didn't make sense. "Didn't we come from that way?" Jenna asked, pointing to a corridor behind them. "I thought so," Amber said, glancing around. Her flashlight flickered, and she smacked it against her palm. Then they heard it, a low, guttural moan echoing from somewhere deep within the asylum. It wasn't the sound of a building settling or the wind, it was alive. "Okay, not funny," Kyle said, spinning in a circle. "Who's messing with us?" No one answered. The moan came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of shuffling footsteps. Amber's grip tightened on her flashlight. "Let's go. Now." But the hallways had changed. The way they came was gone, replaced by a new corridor lined with doors. Each one was slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. We didn't come this way, Jenna said, her voice trembling. Kyle forced a laugh. We probably got turned around. Just stick together. They moved cautiously, their flashlights sweeping the doors. That's when they noticed the writing. Each door had a name scrawled on it, scratched deep into the wood. Amber, Kyle, Jenna. What the hell? Amber whispered, stepping closer to the door with her name. Don't, Jenna said, grabbing her arm. But it was too late. The door creaked open and Amber's flashlight flickered again. For a moment, it illuminated a room filled with hospital beds, each one occupied. The patients were motionless, their faces hidden beneath blood-stained sheets. Then the light went out. Amber screamed as something cold and wet brushed against her arm. She stumbled back, slamming into Kyle. Run! He shouted, dragging her away from the door. The hallway stretched before them, impossibly long. Doors slammed shut on either side as they ran, the sound echoing like gunfire. Where's Jenna? Amber cried, glancing over her shoulder. Kyle stopped, spinning around. Jenna! She was gone. The moaning returned, joined by faint whispers. They came from everywhere and nowhere, overlapping until they formed words. You shouldn't be here. Amber's breath hitched as the shadows at the end of the hallway began to move. Figures emerged, their forms twisted and wrong, their faces obscured by surgical masks stained with dark, wet streaks. Go, Kyle yelled, shoving Amber forward. They sprinted, but the hallway kept stretching, the figures closing in behind them. Amber's lungs burned, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Then she tripped. Kyle skidded to a halt, turning back to help her. But before he could reach her, the figures swarmed. Their long, bony hands wrapped around her arms and legs, pulling her into the darkness. Amber! Kyle screamed, but she was gone. He ran blindly, tears streaming down his face until he burst through a door and into the night. The asylum loomed behind him, silent and foreboding. Kyle staggered back to town, babbling incoherently about shadows and voices. When the police searched the asylum the next day, they found no trace of Amber or Jenna. But in one of the patient rooms, etched into the wall, were 3 new names: Amber, Jenna, Kyle, and beneath them, fresh and wet, waiting.
Story number 6.
The cabin in Dead Man's Grove had been abandoned for decades, sitting at the edge of a dense, suffocating forest. Locals whispered that the cabin was cursed, that anyone who stayed there wouldn't make it through the night. The few brave enough to enter never returned, and those who wandered too close swore they heard screams coming from within. Eleanor didn't believe in curses. A paranormal investigator with a growing online following, she was determined to spend the night in the cabin and debunk the legend. Armed with her camera, an EMF reader, and a flashlight, she hiked into the woods at sunset, her breath visible in the crisp autumn air. The grove was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of her boots crunching against the forest floor. When she reached the cabin, her first thought was how utterly ordinary it looked. A small, weathered structure with a sagging roof and boarded-up windows. Eleanor set up her camera just inside the doorway. Here we are, she said, speaking into the lens. Deadman's Grove. Let's see if it lives up to its name. The interior was barren, stripped of anything that might suggest someone had lived there. The floorboards creaked under her weight, and the air smelled of mildew and rot. Hours passed without incident. Eleanor explored the cabin, documenting its every corner. No ghosts yet, she joked to the camera, holding up the EMF reader, which remained stubbornly silent. But then, as the sun disappeared and the shadows deepened, things began to change. It started with the tapping. At first, it was faint, like fingernails drumming against wood. Eleanor froze, listening. The sound came from the far corner of the room, where the darkness seemed thicker, almost tangible. She aimed her flashlight, but it revealed nothing. Probably just the wind, she muttered, though the windows were sealed tight. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate. It wasn't random. It had a rhythm, a pattern, like someone or something was trying to communicate. Eleanor grabbed her camera and pointed it toward the corner. If there's someone here, make yourself known, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the temperature dropped sharply, her breath fogging the air. The flashlight flickered, and when it stabilized, she saw it. A handprint on the wall, long and skeletal, the fingers impossibly thin. It hadn't been there before. Okay, Eleanor whispered, her heart pounding. This is This is good evidence. She stepped closer, her camera fixed on the handprint, but as she neared, the wall beneath it rippled like water disturbed by a pebble. The tapping resumed, this time from the ceiling. She tilted her head back and her flashlight beam caught movement. Something crawled along the beams above her, its limbs impossibly long, its body twisted at unnatural angles. It moved with a sickening, jerky grace, its head snapping toward her. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were hollow pits that oozed a dark, viscous liquid. Its mouth stretched into a grin far too wide, revealing teeth like jagged shards of glass. Eleanor stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. Darkness swallowed the room, leaving her with only the faint red glow of her camera's recording light. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The creature's voice was a low, guttural rasp, like dry leaves scraping against stone. "We are many. We are hunger." The walls around her began to shift, the wood groaning as it pulsed like a living thing. Shadows stretched and twisted, forming grotesque shapes that seemed to leer at her. Eleanor bolted for the door, but it slammed shut before she reached it. The creature dropped from the ceiling, landing with a sickening crack that didn't seem to bother it. It crawled toward her, its limbs bending in ways that defied anatomy. Desperate, Eleanor swung the EMF reader at it, but the device passed through the creature as though it weren't there. The shadows closed in, their whispers growing louder, overlapping into a deafening roar. "Join us," they chanted. "Stay with us." The last thing Eleanor saw was the creature's gaping mouth lunging toward her, the darkness swallowing her whole. When the search party arrived days later, they found her camera lying in the middle of the cabin. The footage was intact, but Eleanor was gone. The final recording showed her panicked face as she whispered into the lens, "If you find this, don't come here. Don't." Her words were cut off by a guttural growl, followed by the sound of splintering wood and a wet, tearing noise. The camera cut to black, but the audio continued for a few seconds longer. In those final moments, a voice could be heard, low and mocking, whispering, "We are still hungry."
Story number 7.
The Vanishing Trail was one of those places locals avoided at all costs. Nestled deep within Black Hollow Forest, the trail was infamous for the dozens of hikers who had entered but never come out. No bodies were ever found, no belongings recovered, just whispers of strange lights, disembodied voices, and a haunting melody that lured people off the path. Kara and her boyfriend Liam weren't locals. Visiting the small town for a weekend getaway, they were intrigued by the stories. Liam, ever the thrill-seeker, insisted they explore the trail. "It's just a hike," he said, flashing his usual confident grin. People love to make up scary stories to keep it interesting. Kara wasn't so sure. Something about the way the townspeople had looked at them when they mentioned the trail, the nervous glances, the hurried warnings, unsettled her. But she didn't want to seem paranoid, so she reluctantly agreed. They set out just before dusk, determined to make it to the summit and back before nightfall. The first mile of the trail was unremarkable. Tall, gnarled trees bordered the path, their branches casting long shadows across the ground. Birds chirped overhead, and the forest felt alive. But as they ventured deeper, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavy, the kind of heaviness that made it hard to breathe. The forest became eerily silent, the usual sounds of nature replaced by an oppressive stillness. "Creepy," Liam said, his voice louder than it needed to be. Kara nodded, glancing at the trees. She could have sworn they looked different now. Closer, somehow, their trunks twisting in impossible ways. Then they heard it. A soft humming carried on the wind. It was faint at first, almost pleasant, like a lullaby. But as they continued, the melody grew louder, more insistent. It didn't sound like it was coming from any one direction. It surrounded them, weaving through the trees. "You hear that?" Kara asked, gripping Liam's arm. "Yeah." He frowned, scanning the woods. "It's probably just, I don't know, someone messing around." Kara wasn't convinced. The sound was too strange, too alien to be someone playing a joke. They kept walking, but the trail began to change. The well-worn dirt path became overgrown, the edges bleeding into the forest. They passed a wooden sign that read "Keep Out" in faded red letters, but Liam brushed it off. "Probably just an old marker," he said, stepping over it. Kara hesitated, glancing back the way they'd come. The trail behind them seemed different now, darker and narrower, as though it were closing in. "Maybe we should turn back," she suggested. "We're fine," Liam said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. The humming grew louder, joined by whispers. At first, The whispers were indistinct, like leaves rustling in the wind, but then Kara realized they were words. Come closer. Don't be afraid. Stay with us. Kara grabbed Liam's hand. We need to go. Now. Okay, he said, his face pale. They turned back, but the trail was gone. In its place was a tangle of roots and brambles stretching endlessly into the forest. Wait. Liam spun in a circle. It was right here. I know it was right here. Kara's pulse quickened. The whispers grew louder, almost desperate, and the humming transformed into a mournful wail. The trees seemed to shift and move, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal arms. Shadows danced between them, too fast to follow. Then they saw the lights. Flickering orbs of pale blue hovered in the distance, moving like will-o'-the-wisps. What is that? Kara whispered, backing away. Liam grabbed her arm. We have to follow them. Maybe they lead out. No. Kara yanked her arm free. You don't follow the lights, Liam. That's how people disappear. But he didn't listen. He stepped toward the lights, his expression dazed, as if he were in a trance. Liam, stop! Kara shouted, but he kept walking. The lights drifted further into the forest, and Liam followed without hesitation. Desperate, Kara ran after him, grabbing his shoulder and spinning him around. Snap out of it! His eyes met hers, but they weren't his eyes anymore. They were black, empty voids, and his mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. It's beautiful, he said, his voice hollow and distant. Kara screamed and stumbled back. Liam turned and walked into the forest, his figure swallowed by the shadows. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, and the lights multiplied, surrounding her. She ran, her lungs burning, her heart pounding in her chest. The forest seemed endless, twisting and folding in on itself, but she didn't stop. When she finally burst through the tree line and onto the main road, the forest fell silent. She collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. The search party found no trace of Liam. The trail they'd taken was gone, replaced by an unbroken wall of trees. Kara left town the next day, but she could never forget the sound of the whispers or the way Liam's eyes had looked before he disappeared. Sometimes, late at night, she thought she heard the humming again, faint and far away, calling her back to the forest, and deep down she knew she'd never truly escaped.
Story number 8.
The house at the end of Blackthorn Lane was cursed. Everyone in town knew it. Over the years, it had been a church, a school, and finally, a family home before tragedy struck. The last occupants, the Crawfords, had vanished overnight, leaving behind a dining table set for dinner and bloodstains on the walls. The house had sat empty ever since, its windows like dark, watching eyes. Jenna had always been fascinated by the paranormal, so when she inherited the property from a distant relative, she wasn't afraid. She was intrigued. Against the warnings of the locals, she decided to move in. Her first night in the house was uneventful. She unpacked her belongings, cleaned up the layers of dust, and settled into her new home. It wasn't until the second night that things began to change. It started with the clock. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway hadn't worked in decades, its hands frozen at 3:15. But as Jenna lay in bed that night, she heard its chime echo through the house. The sound was deep and resonant, each toll rattling her chest. She got up, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor, and stepped into the hallway. The clock stood silent, its hands still stuck at 3:15. Old houses make noises, she muttered to herself, though the unease in her chest said otherwise. The next morning she found scratches on the walls. Long, jagged marks carved deep into the wood, as though something with claws had been trying to get out. Jenna ran her fingers over the grooves. Rodents, she said, though the marks were far too large for any animal. That evening, she set up cameras around the house. If something was making the noises, she wanted to know what. By midnight, the house was alive with sound. Footsteps echoed upstairs, though Jenna was the only one there. Doors creaked open and slammed shut on their own. The air grew colder, her breath visible in the dim light of her bedside lamp. She gripped her phone, watching the live feed from the cameras. The screen showed empty hallways, unmoving furniture, and something else. In the living room, a shadow appeared. Tall, featureless, and wrong. It stood in the center of the room, swaying slightly as if it were breathing. Jenna's stomach twisted as she watched the shadow move toward the camera. Its form grew darker, more solid, until it filled the screen. Then the feed cut to static. The sound of heavy, dragging footsteps echoed from the hallway outside her bedroom. Jenna grabbed her flashlight and flung the door open, shining the beam into the dark. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps continued, circling her. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The light flickered, and for a moment she saw them, figures standing at the edge of the beam. There were at least a dozen, their faces pale and blurred, their eyes black pits. They stared at her, unmoving, their mouths slightly open as though they were about to speak. But they didn't speak. They screamed. The sound was deafening, an inhuman wail that reverberated through the house. Jenna dropped the flashlight and covered her ears, but the sound was inside her head, clawing at her thoughts. She stumbled back into her bedroom and slammed the door shut, locking it behind her. The screaming stopped, replaced by whispers. "Why did you come? You don't belong here. Join us." The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they were a cacophony. Jenna pressed herself against the door, tears streaming down her face. Then she heard the laughter. It was soft at first, almost childlike, but it grew louder and more distorted, echoing through the room. The temperature plummeted, and frost spread across the windows. The bedroom mirror cracked, and something moved behind her reflection. A figure stood there, a woman with hollow eyes and a twisted smile, her dress soaked in blood. Jenna turned, but there was no one there. When she looked back at the mirror, the woman was closer. "You can't leave," the woman whispered, her voice like shattering glass. Jenna grabbed her keys and bolted for the front door, but the house wouldn't let her go. The walls groaned, the floor buckled beneath her feet, and the shadows stretched, reaching for her. She reached the door just as it slammed shut on its own. The next morning, Jenna's car was found parked neatly in the driveway, her belongings still inside. The house was empty, silent as ever, but the scratches on the walls were deeper now, and the clock had started ticking again, its hands moving slowly toward 3:15.
Story number 9.
Deep within the heart of an uncharted forest, locals spoke of a place they dared not enter, a stretch of woods known as the Whispering Vale. The stories told of strange occurrences, low murmurs when no one was around, shadows that didn't match the light, and a sinister pull that lured the curious to their doom. It began with Sam, a nature photographer who scoffed at the warnings. Determined to capture the untouched beauty of the forest, he ventured in alone, carrying only his camera and a headlamp. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Sam felt an uneasy stillness settle over the woods. The usual symphony of nocturnal animals was absent, replaced by an oppressive silence. The deeper he went, the more the air seemed to thicken, as though unseen eyes were pressing against his skin. Then came the whispers, soft at first, like a breeze threading through leaves. They grew louder, weaving together into an unintelligible chorus. Sam spun around, his flashlight slicing through the dark, revealing nothing but endless trees. Panic bubbled under his skin, but he pressed on, driven by curiosity and a stubborn refusal to believe in the supernatural. His camera began capturing things his eyes couldn't see, faint figures standing just at the edge of the frame, their hollow eyes staring. When he reviewed the photos, his hands trembled, but he still refused to leave. As the hours dragged on, Sam came across an abandoned campsite. The fire pit was cold, the tent torn to shreds, but the belongings, flashlights, clothes, even a half-eaten meal looked fresh. It was as if whoever had been there had vanished in the middle of a mundane moment. The whispers returned, louder now, their words still just out of reach. Then he saw it, a figure, pale and gaunt, standing among the trees. Its face was smooth and featureless, but it tilted its head as if studying him. Sam ran. The forest seemed to shift around him, twisting and warping so that no path looked familiar. His flashlight flickered and died, leaving him in complete darkness. The whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar, and he tripped, landing face first in the damp earth. When he scrambled to his feet, the figure was inches away. A single whisper broke through the chaos. "Stay." The world tilted, and Sam's vision went black. Weeks later, hikers found his camera near the edge of the woods. The photos were released to the media, a mix of breathtaking landscapes and increasingly disturbing images of shadowy figures. But one picture stood out. The last shot, a blurry image of Sam's terrified face, mouth open in a silent scream with a pale hand reaching toward him from the darkness. Sam was never found, and those who ventured into the Whispering Vale after him reported seeing his silhouette among the trees, camera in hand, whispering to them in a voice that wasn't his own.
Story number 10.
The woods were known as Black Hollow, a dense, suffocating expanse of trees that seemed to block out sunlight even during the brightest days. No one ventured there, not after what happened to the Malone family decades ago. But Alex, a thrill-seeker and budding paranormal investigator, thought it was all nonsense. He packed his gear, flashlights, cameras, and audio recorders, and made his way into the heart of the cursed forest. The first sign that something was wrong came less than an hour in. The air grew colder, unnaturally so, and carried with it a metallic tang, like blood on the wind. The birds that chirped at the forest's edge were nowhere to be heard, and Alex's footsteps felt muffled, as if the ground itself swallowed sound. He set up his equipment near the ruins of the Malone cabin, or what was left of it. The charred remains of the house barely stood, but there were signs no one could explain. Fresh scratch marks on the wood, footprints in the ash. As Alex surveyed the scene, his audio recorder picked up faint static. He pressed his headphones to his ears and froze. Beneath the hiss, he heard something unmistakable, a child's laughter. Spinning around, he saw nothing but trees and shadows. Shaking it off, he began exploring deeper into the woods. The laughter followed him, sometimes closer, sometimes far away. It sounded playful, but there was something wrong about it. Something hollow, like it wasn't meant to exist in this world. Then he found the dolls. Scattered in the underbrush were small, handmade dolls, their features carved with unsettling detail. Each one was nailed to a tree, their painted eyes wide with fear. Some were missing limbs, their bodies twisted unnaturally, as though whoever created them wanted them to suffer. Alex reached out to touch one, and as his fingers brushed the cold wood, the laughter turned into sobbing. It was loud, coming from everywhere at once. He backed away, heart racing, and tripped over something soft. Looking down, he realized it was another doll, but this one was different. Its face was blank, its mouth sewn shut with coarse black thread. He swore its head moved as he stared at it, twisting slightly toward him. Panicking, Alex grabbed his camera and tried to leave, but the path was gone. No matter which way he turned, the forest stretched endlessly in all directions. The sobbing grew louder, now mixed with whispers, voices layered upon each other, chanting something in a language he didn't understand. His flashlight began to flicker. In its dying beam, Alex saw movement in the distance, small figures darting between the trees. They were children, or at least they looked like children, their faces pale and distorted. They stared at him with wide, empty eyes, their mouths opening far too wide to reveal jagged, unnatural teeth. One by one, they began to whisper, "You shouldn't have come." As the flashlight gave out completely, Alex heard something behind him. A guttural growl, low and menacing, echoed through the woods. Turning slowly, he came face to face with something towering, its body a grotesque fusion of tree and flesh, its gnarled limbs stretching toward him. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, and from its twisted mouth came a sound that could only be described as hunger. The last thing Alex felt was the cold grip of a hand on his shoulder, pulling him into the dark. Days later, his equipment was found scattered near the Malone cabin. The footage on his camera showed only static, but in one brief frame, his terrified face was visible. Behind him, in the shadows, a dozen pale figures stared at the lens, smiling.